Hello, this is the sermon for the National Indigenous Day of Prayer, Sunday, June 21st, 2026. And the texts preached on are Isaiah chapter 40, verses 25 to 31, Philippians chapter 4, verses 4 to 9, and John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18. Today, June 21st, is the National Indigenous Day of Prayer, which was established by our national church in 2010 as a feast that takes precedence over the regular Sunday observance. Indeed, in years in which the National Indigenous Day of Prayer does not fall on a Sunday, many churches transfer it to the nearest following Sunday in order that it may be observed, as is often done with other major feasts, such as the feasts of the Ascension and of the Transfiguration. For centuries, after the European conquest and settlement of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of Turtle Island have been variously marginalized, enslaved, ethnically cleansed, or otherwise oppressed. As recently as the 1960s, the Canadian federal government championed a thoroughly assimilationist approach to Canada's First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And although much progress has been made over the past few decades to alleviate the often bleak circumstances facing many Indigenous Canadians, there is still work to be done. Of course, it may seem that there is little that we can do as individuals or as a small town parish about the continued need for redress and reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous peoples. We do have a land acknowledgement, which we alternatively display or recite every Sunday, and that is something, but a land acknowledgement only goes so far toward effecting reconciliation. One elder leading the course on Indigenous Christianity that I took this past winter liked to joke that a land acknowledgement was like making a rent acknowledgement to your landlord. You acknowledge that you are supposed to pay rent, but never actually do. Having a land acknowledgement is a good first step, but by itself it is not enough. Of course, this raises the question of what else can be done. Of course, we first need to answer the question of whether we actually need to do anything special with respect to reconciliation between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Now, as Anglicans, our legacy includes our institutional church's involvement in running residential schools, which, as we all know, did untold harm to the vast majority of the tens of thousands of Indigenous children forced to attend them for more than a century. On the other hand, none of us here today have had anything to do with residential schools, nor did our diocese actually run one. It may not seem fair that we should have to be held responsible for the misdeeds of others. Let us set aside that question for now and look at what our scriptures for today have to say to us. Both of today's passages from the Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians and from John's Gospel come from the First Nations version, a recent translation into English of the New Testament that employs an Indigenous storytelling idiom, which is why they sounded at once so familiar and yet so different. In the First Nations version, the names of people are translated according to what their names may be said to mean. So, for example, Jesus is called Creator Sets Free. Paul does not refer to himself by name in today's passage from his letter to the Philippians, but we might have chuckled had he had, since his name in the First Nations version is Small Man. You may remember from the season of Christmastide, when we last heard today's passage from John's Gospel, that the Gospel acknowledges that it is possible to ignore or deny the incarnate Word. He came down into this world, and even though he made all things, the world did not recognize him. Even his own tribe did not welcome or honor him. Likewise, part of the reason Paul writes the letter to the Philippians in order to encourage the Christians of Philippi to use his own way of life as a model for their own life in Christ, as he does in today's passage, is to warn them not to adopt the way of life of those whom he calls enemies of the cross of Christ. Roughly put, to be an enemy of the cross of Christ is to ignore or deny the authority that Jesus' teachings have for our lives. It should be acknowledged that this means that many professed Christians can still be enemies of the cross of Christ if they do not pattern their lives after Christ's own, while many non-Christians can be said to accept Jesus by the way they live their lives. It is by patterning our lives after Christ's own that we receive him. And to receive Christ is to become part of God's family, as it says in today's passage from John's Gospel. But all who welcome and trust him receive their birthright as children of the Great Spirit. They are born in a new way, not from a human father's plans or desires, but born from above, by the Great Spirit. What it looks like to pattern our lives after Christ's own is to give of ourselves in loving service to others, as Jesus gave of himself in loving service to others. We are not called to the same sacrificial self-giving as Jesus was, but if our service is to be genuine, it must make a difference in our own lives and in the lives of those whom we serve. The question, then, is what that looks like. There are two aspects to the loving service to which we are called. The first is that we are called to do simple things, just like how Jesus respectfully engaged with the Samaritan woman at the well. We can do such easy things as treating others with kindness. It should not be hard to serve. The second aspect is that we are called to serve others in all we do. Our calling to lovingly serve others is a lifelong commitment. This does not mean that we are supposed to neglect our own well-being, but it does mean that, when it is safe or healthy to do so, we should put the needs of others before our own. As Paul says elsewhere in his letter to the Philippians, each of you should look to the needs of others, not just to your own. This is patterning our lives after Christ's in a nutshell. We should work for reconciliation with our Indigenous siblings then, not out of shame or guilt, but because, first of all, to work toward reconciliation is to do as Jesus did. It is to pattern our lives after Christ's own. Second of all, we shall be blessed if we work for reconciliation, because it serves the least of these. As Jesus says to the righteous among the nations in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew's Gospel, "The blessing of my Father rests upon you. Come into the land of Creator's good road that has been prepared for you from the beginning of the world. For I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was hungry, and you fed me. I was a stranger, and you gave me lodging. When I needed clothes, you gave me something to wear. When I was sick, you took care of me, and when I was in prison, you visited me." "When did we do all these things for you?" the good-hearted ones asked. "I speak from my heart," he answered them. "Whatever you did for the least important of my fellow human beings who needed help, you did for me." Now, there certainly are Indigenous people who are well off and who can take care of themselves, but taken as a whole, Indigenous Canadians certainly qualify as the least of them. To serve them by working toward reconciliation is to claim for ourselves Christ's most powerful blessing. Whatever we decide to do, whether as individuals or as a church community, we can trust that God blesses us for doing so. For to do so is to enter into, as the First Nations version puts it, the land of Creator's good road, which has been our true home from the beginning of the world.